Hi, I'm Greg Euland with Reynolds & Reynolds, and this is Connected. Recalls are something that dealers have been servicing for decades, but historically it's been a pretty reactive process. You take care of customers as they come in or as manufacturers send out notices, but there can be some big gaps, especially for off-make models when those come into your service drive or if you take them in on a trade. Today we're sitting down with Scott Allen, CEO of Recall Masters, to discuss what they're doing to help and how you can adjust in your dealership. Let's get connected. All right, Scott Allen, CEO at Recall Masters. Thanks so much for sitting down and chatting.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Scott. So your company puts out the state of the recalls every year, and this is a pretty extensive report. What are some of the takeaways in there? What should dealers know at a high level?
That's a great question. You know, I think the origin of us publishing the State of the Recalls going back to 2017 was really the best way that we could bring awareness to the industry. You know, dealers, manufacturers alike, the pure amount of and volume of recalls that come out each and every month, let alone year, very few are aware of. So to be able to break down by the various, brands, models, makes, things of that nature, that's probably one of the biggest value propositions that the dealer groups we work with, and they appreciate on that. So it's just constant awareness and visibility into what's out there, the opportunities and so forth.
Yeah. So how do dealers stay on top of recalls, not just when they become mandatory and letters get sent out and that kind of stuff, but even early on? How do they effectively know what's out there, where they should focus and how they should attack it?
Greg, that's a good question.
Thank you.
I would say, in the last several years, things have definitely evolved a little bit from the manufacturer side. When we established our company in the 2015, 2016 era, there wasn't a lot of information. Many of the manufacturers didn't necessarily want to be proactive in promoting that their brand, had potential defects but all of that's changed, and I'd like to think Recall Masters had a little bit to do with that. We've been able to prove in the last several years that when you can be proactive, and take care of the consumer,
yep,
you're actually, doing a good thing for the brand, not only, the manufacturer brand, but also the dealership. So, but they're still a little reluctant, with all the different nuances around parts availability, the stop sales, all these little things that go with recalls. Many of the manufacturers are still a little slow to bring this information to the forefront.
Right.
But that's where we come in.
So without doing that for a dealer, if they're not kind of at the forefront of when a recall is happening and knowing what's out there, almost in a proactive way rather than a reactive way, what's kind of at risk for them? What's the downside to not being on top of that?
The dealer themselves has a lot to lose if they are not made aware. Historically, when a safety recall backed by the government would come out, many times either the parts wouldn't be available. Maybe the dealership, depending on who that franchise dealer was, might not have the right technician capacity. And so if massive communications are going to a consumer body and the franchise dealer is not prepared, oftentimes the average consumer doesn't know how to differentiate the manufacturer from the dealer and who's responsible. So, the more information that the dealers can have, they can prepare better. So the consumers are handled more appropriately. The dealer saves face. The customer's happy. The dealers can also have a huge impact on their CSI. CSI before retention is, you're aware, was front and center. And many of the manufacturers are rating and judging their franchise dealers on their CSI score. And yet, if the consumers are holding the dealership accountable for getting these recalls remedied and they weren't able to prepare ahead of time, we see bad surveys. Today we have Google, Yelp, all these social media channels. So I guess that would be the second part to my answer, which is the dealers really were in the crosshairs prior to having this information available.
Yep. All right, so let's take a step back then, just to make sure. I guess for me, I have a clear understanding because there are tools out there, a number of tools out there for dealers to access recalls, right? You go into a store, everything from, like, for me, I had a recall on my car. I get an alert on my phone that says, hey, there's a recall. It's open, or, got the little icon, right, a little red dot on the app that says, hey, check this out. So the consumer's getting notified when I go in for service. The dealer can check those things through a variety of tools. So with Recall Masters specifically, what gap are you guys filling, right? What, as a company, there's these tools and these ways for dealers to know about this stuff. What gap are you filling specifically?
There's 36 different companies that we've been working with over the years, but part of the relationship that we've been able to form with Reynolds and Reynolds is a great example. Is the fact that the integration that's been able to be accomplished has almost made it foolproof for any touch point, whether it be on the trading a car in, whether it be a car in inventory, more commonly cars coming through the service lane. I can give you a statistic. I can tell you that 5 to 8% of every consumer that enters a franchise dealer service lane with one or more open recalls leaves with an open recall. And we have the stats and data to back that up, but that's why having an integration such as we've been able to accomplish with Reynolds, to where that every touch point that a consumer is going to interact with the dealer that's using the Reynolds system is going to have immediate visibility into that. So I'd like to think that from a data standpoint, the accuracy on those specific recalls, we're a contributor.
Yep.
But by all means, it takes an army, and in this case, integration through software touch points to make sure that the dealer, the consumers, don't miss those opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. So then when they get those opportunities, you mentioned that a decent percentage of people that come in with an open recall leave with an open recall in service. And I think part of that is certainly awareness. Part of it also has got to be the ability of the service advisor to sell the recall work, right? So, yep, it's free. Yep, they're going to take care of it. The consumer doesn't have to pay, but it still takes time, right? You're going to have my car for a while. I need to get to work. I came in for an oil change, and now you want my car for the day. Any tips, I guess, for selling that?
We try our level best to not even couple the word sell, as you
That's
mentioned,
fair.
because this is a completely free, to the consumer. It's something that needs to happen on the recall front. But to your point,
but you're still asking them for time, right? You might not be asking them for money, but you're asking them for time. So
right, and so getting ahead of that, meaning that to the best of the ability, if a dealer has the software tools, the integration, the awareness at point of scheduling the appointment. Most consumers, there's still a fair amount that might come in on that same day, but I would think that a consumer that just shows up saying, "Hey, I need to get my car serviced," I think they're going to be more reasonable that they may need to come back if they have additional work. But where we see great upside to the consumer population, the industry as a whole, is at time of scheduling that appointment, just giving that dealership an extra 2-3 days to order the parts, make sure the technicians are available, really alleviates the majority of what you're bringing up. So therefore, and as an end result, the consumer's handled promptly. When the consumer's handled in a very professional, fluid way, we see often 58% of those repair orders have additional customer pay work tied to them.
Really?
So it's a win-win for everybody.
Interesting. Okay. So on that additional customer pay work, do you know, could you break it down further? What types of work is that? Is that kind of your typical add-ons like an alignment or wipers or a detail or something like that? Or is that the type of stuff you see usually?
It's all across the board. But what I would absolutely tell you, again, back to time, time that the consumer would be prepared to either leave a vehicle, so depending on the dealership, if they, these are little awkward or unique times, I guess we all know in the industry with inventory being at an all-time low. But if a dealership happens to offer like loaner cars as an example, or a very very consumer-friendly pickup and delivery valet service, we can see some of those higher dollar jobs that might take an extra day.
Yeah.
But probably the most common is your regular maintenance and oil services. Yeah. So recall, maybe a consumer. I'll give you another stat. 82% of every consumer last year that came in to get their recall done based off the efforts that we provide, they were out of warranty. Okay. And many of those, about 80% of those hadn't been to the franchise dealer in 12 to 48 months or longer. So they're getting their oil service done at the independent Jiffy Lube,
right,
or similar. The recall brings them in. As long as they have a good experience, they're much more apt to say, "Okay, I'll do this, this, and this." So, oil services, regular maintenance are probably the highest.
That's great.
I live in California, so we don't have a lot of windshield wiper refillments, but I know in the Midwest we see those as well. So.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. No, that's good. All right. So you had mentioned best practice is really getting appointments scheduled ahead of time so you can order parts. Have you seen any dealers take on a strategy for stocking parts too? So if there are, 4, 5, 6 recalls that they're seeing consistently, or maybe it's just a couple of them consistently, is there a way for them to make sure they have the parts available? I mean, a lot of that's dictated by the OEM, but are there ways for them to make sure that they have the parts needed?
Depending on the specific recall, and I'll just give you an idea of the scope of recalls that fall into a safety category. We're over 13,000 that Recall Masters houses, and that number grows by at least 100 to 200 new recalls a month. So some of the newer recalls, depending on the manufacturer, might require the appointment to be scheduled before that franchise dealer can order a part. But there is plenty of recalls going back, that have been open over the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years, where a dealership might have a lot of their money tied up in parts. Yeah. So for those that, we know that that's cash. And so it's easy to work with a dealership to see of the abundance of opportunities if certain recalls that are available to them can help clear their parts shelves. The dealers like that a lot. Yeah. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but it's all about managing the process through visibility, so that the dealer has a good experience, the consumer has a good experience, and ultimately it's a win-win. And when inventory comes back into play here, who knows? You take care of the customer, they often buy a new car.
For sure.
So
yeah, people are buying when they can. That's for sure. All right. Well, hey Scott, what else haven't we talked about? Anything else you want to touch on while we have a minute here?
I think it's worth noting that right before our lives were changed here a couple years ago, and we're starting to get back to a little normality. Some of the things weren't as much brought to our attention then that are now is, various brands, most of them are really focused on, again, the retention. The manufacturers are putting a lot of pressure on their franchise dealer body to ensure that they're servicing a certain amount of the vehicles in their market. And so as a byproduct of just doing a really good job and getting in front of these recalls, we've seen a significant uptick with our dealers and the dealers that utilize our services through rentals or otherwise, at having uptick in retention. So that is absolutely an area that comes to mind when you ask the question. So, recalls, again, handled professionally with a process. There's a lot of benefits to the dealer with that. So
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Scott Allen, CEO of Recall Masters, thank you so much for joining.
Appreciate it. All right. Take care.
Thanks so much for joining the conversation today. Before we hop off, don't forget you can watch or listen to episodes of Connected on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify podcasts. And make sure to hit subscribe so you're notified every other Wednesday when new episodes are released. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.